Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Panayota Papadopoulos. I use she, her pronouns. I am here from Turning Point of Lehigh Valley this morning. I love the way the caption quoted my name. That's hilarious. But I am here. We are here to talk about trauma and healing and the kind of intersection between domestic and intimate partner abuse, as well as mental health in a variety of different perspectives. So before we begin today, I just want to give a brief reminder that, there should be the chat box open and the Q&A box open if at any point you have any questions for the panelists or just for us to discuss. Please feel free to comment and chat, as well as if anyone shares anything. All we ask is that you choose ideally to, if you do share any personally identifying information, we ask that you do not share somebody else's information. So ideally, whatever happens here, whatever is shared here stays here within this group. This conversation is being recorded. So yeah, with that, I think if there are no other, trying to make sure I covered everything. Oh, this webinar will also be offered on demand. So if by chance you are unable to attend, or if you want to share it with somebody after the fact, you can do that as well. So before we begin, I'm actually going to drop a quick poll in the chat, just to get an idea of where everybody is joining us from. So if you take a second, there should be a pop-up on your screen. It's a pretty simple 4-question or 4-answer poll. I figured usually we have a lot of people from our service area from Lehigh, Northampton County. However, we also occasionally will get, a nice visitor from afar. So I'll end this in 5 seconds. 2, 1. Okay, so we're about half. Yeah, half and half. Nice. So before we begin today, I'm going to ask, I guess, my first question, which gives our guest speakers an opportunity to introduce themselves, to tell you a little bit about what they do. So with us, we have Maggie Murphy of NAMI Lehigh Valley. We have Levi Walbert of Lehigh Valley Center for Independent Living, and Rosa from Bradbury-Sullivan. I don't know why my brain is like, hold on, wait, let me make sure I get the right agency with the right person. So my first question is, and feel free to go in whatever order you choose, but can you tell me a little bit about yourself and your organization and what do you do there? So whoever feels comfortable, jump on in.
I'll go first.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Rosa. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. My official title is, it's kind of a long one. It's the Senior Manager of the LGBTQ plus Education Institute at Bradbury-Sullivan. Just a very fancy way of saying that I teach folks how to be gender inclusive, queer inclusive, non-transphobic in the workplace. I train like doctors, lawyers, other professionals, and that kind of stuff. I work with our team to, share the PA Health Needs Assessment for LGBTQ plus folks in Pennsylvania. And I do a bunch of other stuff with events, like for Pride and that kind of stuff.
Awesome.
Well, I'll go. Good morning, everyone. I'm Maggie Murphy, and I'm honored to be here today. I'm the Executive Director of NAMI Lehigh Valley. We're the local affiliate of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and we provide support and education, information, and referrals for both people who are living with a mental illness and for their family members. Because our overall mission is to improve the quality of life for people living with mental illness.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Levi Walbert, use he, him. I am from Lehigh Valley Center for Independent Living. We are a cross-disabilities nonprofit organization. We do disability advocacy, support, peer groups, general advocacy. My role there is I am the development coordinator. So in that sense, I do a bit of everything when it comes to developing our programs and groups and different things like that. I write our grants. In part, we always do teamwork here. Fundraising, I do some of the graphic design, but I'm also a part of one of our initiatives called Supportive Decision Making Pennsylvania, which is a joint effort between LVCIL and Jewish Family Services of the Lehigh Valley, funded by the PADDC, Pennsylvania Council Disability. I can never remember.
Don't you just love all the acronyms? Yes.
Yeah, we do a lot of acronyms,
Uh,
which is for
mhm.
a dyslexic person like me. Sometimes it's a little tricky, but PADDC, they are funded us, wonderful group. Support decision making is about essentially is alternative to guardianship. Usually, that's an issue regarding a lot of older folks we hear about in the news, but we're focusing a little bit on that from school into adulthood and making sure essentially people maintain as much control over their lives, independent living as possible. So I can go more into that later, but that's a brief introduction. So I do work with them as well.
Yeah, thank you guys. Yeah, when we were planning for this conversation, with mental health, it's hard. It's like physical health. There's so many facets to it that, where do you even begin? And, even in conversations, we were like, how, how do we accurately represent those who are going through mental health struggles in a way that also represents a variety of different perspectives, right? So while this combination I think is kind of unique, we don't necessarily see, our organizations work together in one conversation. I think that, it's really important that all perspectives and identities are really part of the conversation, that we're not isolating or marginalizing those who maybe aren't typically included in the conversation of mental health as a grand spectrum. So all that being said, specifically within your organization and what you do, what are some of the signs or symptoms you might see that overlap in regards to mental health concerns, or even mental health, period, just being mentally healthy?
I can answer that. So it really depends. We have to recognize that mental illness covers a huge range of diagnoses, some of which are fairly mild, some of which are really severe and life-altering. So, with some of the more severe ones, of course, you might see someone who is experiencing hearing voices or seeing things that other people may not be experiencing. They may have extremely rapid and dramatic mood changes, ranging to people who are experiencing mild mood disorders like anxiety or depression, where you could see them perhaps withdrawing, not being as involved as they have been, either in work or family or things that they enjoy, sleeping more, sleeping less, eating more, eating less. There are often those physical changes that go along with a mental illness, or talking about sometimes how they feel, that they are sad or anxious or worried. So there can be a huge range of symptoms around this.
I'll go.
Okay.
I want to just clarify really quick too, like I'll be using the word queer to encompass the LGBTQ plus community, so that I don't have to continuously say LGBTQ plus. So I'll just be saying queer. I know that there's like some like taboo around the word because typically older queer people tend to identify it as like a slur or an insulting word. Millennials typically and younger have reclaimed it to encompass like all of us. So I'll be using queer. I use it for myself. So the thing that I like to bring up with like mental illness and how it impacts like queer people is a lot of the times, like it manifests just like everyone else, right? The major difference is that that accessibility, right? So like if you were a queer person and you want to go get help, right? It might have been caused because your family is super religious, they don't accept you, they've kicked you out. This is highly more prevalent in like trans people. but it encompasses every kind of queer identity, right? So like having that accessibility, having a therapist or a psychiatrist that is competent or affirming of your queer identity, right? That impacts like how we get statistics, how we get support, right? Being wildly misrepresented, misgendering or dead naming somebody is a huge barrier. So for example, if like a trans woman is going to go seek help, she may be referred to as he, simply just because she was assigned male at birth and now she's going through transition. Another thing to note too is the concept of gender dysphoria. I see that a lot in like news or anti-LGBT rhetoric, right? That gender dysphoria is a mental illness and therefore trans people are mentally ill. And that has its own implications, right? Because of the stigma that we attach to being mentally ill. Right. So the thing to acknowledge too is that you can be a cisgender person, right? So if you are assigned female at birth and you identify as a woman, you can also struggle with your gender presentation, right? Depending on what that looks like, right? Maybe you grow a lot of facial hair. Maybe you are infertile. Maybe your body looks, doesn't look as feminine, right? So these are all things that we tend to ignore, but we assign it to queer people because of the bias, right? We consider trans and queer people predatory, they're mentally ill, they're after our children, that kind of stuff. And that creates a lot of barriers, right? When in reality, if they just are affirmed and supported and have access to shelter and that kind of stuff, 9 times out of 10, you get better. So.
When it comes to disability, I mean, there's very, very common is that there's comorbidity between any kind of disability. That's not to say every single person does, but you see it as a very common aspect, especially with different levels of, how much one's disability affects their life and the life around them. So especially in people who have a disability from a young age or born with one. One of the big things that we kind of see, and especially since doing some of this supported decision making and looking at decision making, is that you see the kind of lack of independence that has been put upon people, and who have never really been educated on how to be independent, and never really been allowed to have risk or all these different kinds of aspects. We see pretty much across the board with more decision-making power, more independence, all these things, you end up having better mental health, less trauma. So, it's such a broad spectrum with disability when that comes from physical, it could go mental health from disability, developmental, intellectual, anywhere across there, there's likely a lot of crossover. It's difficult to talk on because so many cases are individualized, but like you said, the comorbidity of it really is a strong aspect in saying, the more we can get people making choices about their own life and having that control, even pride about what they do and the choices they make, it's a big part of what we do. And I guess the big one talking about a lot of it is the idea of competence. And a lot of people who have a disability are presumed to not have it. That is the baseline, unfortunately, a lot of people operate under is someone who is disabled. Well, they need help. They need someone who's not disabled to make a choice for them, to help them, to do anything for them. And, that's what we're seeing, where a lot of people do fight back against that, luckily. But there's a lot of people who, like I said, if you had that younger age or born with it, if you're kind of find yourself in that situation where that is the norm and that's what it's very hard sometimes to break out of it. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling cycle or a secular thing where, well, if you're never allowed to make a decision about yourself or live independently, you're not going to, and then the mental health consequences of not making choices is just strengthening that I'm comfortable letting someone make decisions for me. And, it's secular. So it's a big issue. And unfortunately, since everyone's unique in this, sometimes the way out and the way to better health is so interpersonal.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. Like there's a common thread kind of in what everyone is saying, which, I think it's important to kind of start the conversation with the understanding that, first of all of us have mental health, right? It's not necessarily that we have a mental health diagnosis of some sort, just that like everybody needs their brain to be healthy and their mind to be healthy, right? So, and it sounds like a big, conversation piece in all of this is how affirming and supportive and, you know, healthy it is to have that kind of support, affirmation, that validation, that, people in your immediate vicinity telling you like, hey, it's okay, or like, hey, I go through that too, or, just the ability to make choices. Levi, like you were saying, just having that option, right? And not having choices imposed on you. To talk a little bit kind of about the survivor aspect of things for those going through abuse, there is such a dynamic of power and control that takes place that, really affects a survivor's just mental well-being, period. A lot of times if the narrative from the abuser is, you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, and sort of that imposter syndrome kind of building up, on top of that, having, being gaslit and told like, oh, I didn't say that, or I didn't do that, or that was your fault, right? All of these facets sort of compile and compound on top of each other and make it that much harder for survivors who are just going through, you know, the challenges and the barriers of not having choices, not having support, feeling isolated, but on top of that, potentially having an additional diagnosis, right? So also considering even, in this conversation, right? If a survivor had a diagnosis of a mental uh, health diagnosis or a disability, or, identifies as part of the queer community, right? That how many of these additional barriers may come up that make it more harder for them to receive the support they need. So I guess a big question that I wanted to ask is, what are some of the most common barriers or common stereotypes and myths that you see within your population that you serve that maybe we can kind of dispel and bring up?
I'll go.
Mhm.
I think I kind of covered this a little bit in the first question too, but I'll just like expand on it too. A big thing that like the big barrier or the way that bias manifests towards queer people oftentimes that they're unreliable around children, they're dangerous, they are, predatory just like by default. They're trying to like convince children to be queer and that kind of stuff. Um, and you know, that leads to a slew of other problems, right? Some people can, be like, okay, that's ridiculous. Like, I'm not that way. But other people may internalize it, right? It could affect their family, impact. I said infect as like accidentally, but I think that's what I meant, right? Like it infects your mind. You start to internalize that kind of behavior, right? Like even myself, this is a more of a personal thing as a teacher, right? Like, I worked with middle schoolers, oftentimes I was like afraid to even like hug them or, provide support, right? That can manifest other ways too, right? Like if you're already seen as the enemy and you haven't even done anything, right? Like that can affect your psyche. It can affect how you want to navigate the world. It can affect how you choose to present, right? Like just something as simply as like just wearing like if you're a trans woman, wearing more feminine clothes can help you feel more comfortable. But if that is what makes you a victim, right, they may not want to risk their life to be more comfortable. You know what I mean? And, that's something that a lot of people don't even think about, right? Like, could you imagine like forcing like someone you care about, like, well, no, you can't even wear those shoes because you might get murdered. Or even just like, you might not even go to a doctor. And if you're unconscious, right? Like just stuff like that plays in people's heads. They they're afraid, so
Yeah.
just things to think about.
No, you're right. I think that comes up so much too for survivors, just even, not even having an identity for it, but just, hey, you can't do that because I don't allow it, or, or else. And then there's some kind of consequence added to it. So absolutely. Other barriers or myths or things that we want to kind of tackle while we're here.
I think there are a couple big ones into the mental health arena. And one of those is the myth that if someone gets a diagnosis,
Mhm.
that is going to continue to be how they feel. The symptoms that they're experiencing are going to be symptoms that they're going to experience for the rest of their lives. Not with everyone, of course, but by and large, treatment is really effective. It may take some time to get the right combination of medications if people choose to take medications, or medication, counseling, and talk therapy and other wellness activities. But for the most part, people can have an acute episode of a mental illness and go on to live completely fulfilling, satisfying lives. We talk at NAMI about 1 in 5 adults experiences a mental health incident in a given year in the United States, 1 in 5. And so if you don't think you know anyone who has a mental illness, it is likely that you do, but you can't tell because they're working, they're involved with their families, they're doing things that they enjoy, and it's just not evident at that moment. Another huge one, and this keeps coming up lately, of course, is that people who have a mental illness are violent. And in fact, people who have a serious mental illness are far more likely to be the victim of a crime than to commit a crime. And another one I really like to see go away is very often people confuse mental illness and developmental delay. And we know, and there are examples throughout history of people who are absolutely brilliant and creative and just have remarkable minds who are also living with a mental illness. So I would like to see that go away too.
No, that's important. Absolutely. Yeah.
In the world of disability, one of the big things we've kind of switched to is this notion of the social model of disability, where what a disability is more defined by the barriers that are put up by society that don't allow people to live full, independent lives. So, we say if the whole world, if our society was built within the mind of architecture, with everyone may have to use a wheelchair, and everything is built for a wheelchair, then, we might not see people using wheelchairs necessarily as disabled anymore, because that becomes the assumption or the norm. So I put that out there, but in terms of more specifics, the one that always bothered me that, there's a lot with disabilities in terms of barriers, but one that I think is pretty prevalent is this cultural idea that people with disabilities are like children, insofar that they need the help, but they also they have to be protected very, very deeply. There's this kind of language that still, I remember growing up hearing it. So, oh, he's got the mind of a fourth grader. That's a very common way of saying, oh, he is a fourth grade, in the intellector. Well, that again, it paints this very childlike view, because when we say, okay, that's fine, he might have a fourth grade reading level, but he's 28, and he is interested in things like relationships, romantically, sexually, marriage even. So it says, they might have the reading level of someone who's younger, but they don't have the body or the mind. And there's this constant idea that, well, they're a child, they're still a child trapped in an adult's body. We have to baby them and look out and make all the decisions for them. And one big thing that comes with that is this denial of what's called like the dignity of risk. Every single day we all make risks. It's assumed as an adult you do that. I want to go take a big road trip out somewhere. There's a risk involved. You know what? I want to move out to the city to pursue this job. That's risky. I just want to go take a walk on this path that's, maybe unpaved. Well, that's risky too. But when it comes to just a person with a disability, it's like, whoa, you can't let them do that. They might get hurt. They might get this. Well, yeah, that's part of being an adult. It's part of being a full independent person. It says, yeah, this might turn out badly. So what? That's how we learn. That's how we do things. But very often, people with disabilities are denied that right.
Mm.
So, trying to live your whole life protected in a bubble, I mean, see what that does to your mental health.
No, that's, yeah, there's that almost infantilization of, those who are, um, going through whatever the case may be, whether again, it be a different identity like disabilities or, part of the queer community, or even just, having an identity of a diagnosis of some sort, like, oh, they're not capable. And, as society, it's almost like we are the ones taking away their power and control, which, again, leads to a little bit of an abusive dynamic, if I can say. But yeah,
I was
Levi.
gonna say real quick, I just, wanted to add, I remember personal experience of a very good friend who, with a disability, they were in a wheelchair, limited mobility. Remember being out in public, people, talking to me or talking more slowly to him, or, literally looking down and talking down to him. And I always look at the people and, thought, hey, one, he's just a person sitting. That's all this is. That if I sit down, you're going to talk to me the same way. But the second I said, my friend just got accepted to a PhD program. This guy's smarter than I am. Why are you, talking to him like a child? And it's just so common. Just want to add that personal anecdote along with it, because it's not just the developmental or intellectual. It's even just physical disabilities when people act like they're children.
Yeah.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah.
This isn't like my realm of expertise, but like when you were bringing those topics up, I thought of two things. Glasses, right? Like technically I'm visually impaired,
Mhm.
right? Like if we were out in the caveman world and my vision was, as it is now, I would be technically a disabled person, and I probably would have gotten eaten by like a saber-toothed cat or something, right? Or missed, like, eaten the wrong berry and then died, right? But I have accessibility. And then also texting. When we invent or create things for people with disability, we actually are accommodating a lot more people. And that's something that I try to like talk about in a lot of my trainings too, is like, even if you are not a queer person, or you're not a disabled person or someone with mental health, right? When these accessibility things don't become an issue, your life is actually better. You know what I mean? So just some things to, I was inspired, so I wanted to share.
No, this is what it's for. This is the discussion, right? This is the conversation that, absolutely we need to, again, it comes back down to that reaffirmation, that validation of like every, identity is valued and supported. And there was something that I was thinking of too, Maggie, when you were talking with the 1 in 5, where I think you said it was 1 in 5 people at any point in the, are going through a mental health crisis. And it made me think of, I'm not on TikTok a lot, but on the occasion that I am, I'm always looking up like social, related things. And there was this thread going around like, show me a video of the time that you were going through the worst time of your life, right? And a lot of times the videos were people like happy at parties, like you really couldn't tell, so to speak, right? That in a way we are almost creating that societal barrier, that expectation that people have to be outgoing to be happy and have to be, yeah. So absolutely. I thought that was another interesting point that, you really never know what people are going through behind closed doors. You really never know what, what's going on, and absolutely important. So we have some comments in the chat that I want to briefly mention. Some people are saying, this is great. You guys are wonderful. Brian, you rock. I want this recording. And then somebody said, I heard it yesterday and it's so powerful. We, slash the business slash public, have so many accommodations for able bodies, like lights in a room or chairs in a cafeteria. We don't think twice about not having those things. So yeah, absolutely. Like, again, it comes back down to that accessibility, that valuing every identity that is in the room and making sure that they feel heard, supported, and yeah, and included ultimately. Other thoughts? Should I keep going?
One thing I'll add, just in the crossover, some of this stuff,
Yeah.
talking about these disability, when we look at people we act like they're children, we act like they have less agency and less self-awareness. So when people are having, like a mental illness, one of the disability, there's a tendency not to believe them even further than people who are, presented as not having a disability. And the same goes for queer identities. I mean, you definitely know that we see statistically on average, like for instance, within the community autism, you see a statistical higher average people who are gender nonconforming or trans or queer. And, those people are, again, just on a basis, that identity tends not to be taken as seriously or as real, but then add a disability on top of it and goes, well, they're disabled, they're autistic, they're just doing something, it's not taken as seriously. And again, these things all interconnect and trickle into just continuously being pushed into the marginalization and, these kind of liminal areas of society.
As a former teacher myself, having worked with those who had IEPs, individualized education plans, 504s, et cetera, and just needed to have that educational support around their education and schooling. A lot of times I felt that those students were actually more self-aware because they were having those conversations with people, because they were, able to kind of take that time to self-reflect with, a trained professional to support. I mean, it comes back to, as well as like therapy, you were saying, where, having that space, that safe space to kind of reflect and find what works best for you and, learn how to self-advocate in those moments where maybe I don't feel as heard or included. So yeah, this is great. Thank you guys. I guess my next question, which kind of flowing forward, in regards to healing, right? So a lot of these identities have been through levels of trauma, but we also want to support their healing as well and the journey outside of that. So it's sort of twofold. How can we provide better language around, supporting that journey of healing? And also, how can we be more trauma informed for the communities that we serve? What are some of the things that you see in regards to language or being trauma informed that maybe we need to toss in the bucket and, move forward from?
I love this question. So shameless plug, if you ever do, or if your company or group or whatever ever sits through any of my trainings, I talk about how the use of language often contributes to bias and then eventually trickles down into social bias and then legal bias, right? Like a big thing within the queer community, right, is that, we are mentally ill, right? Which is a twofold problem, right? Like you're implying that someone who's mentally ill is not capable of acknowledging or being self-aware, but then also you're implying that they're violent or, that they're sick or there's something wrong with them. And you know what I'm saying? So like it creates that double-edged sword. I talk about how like just being familiar with how like what language we use when identifying a barrier, right? The barrier isn't that someone is trans or that someone is queer or that someone is disabled. The barrier is that they're being treated poorly, right? The problem and the responsibility isn't on the queer person to be less queer, right? We see it all the time in professional settings, right? Like why every single teacher that I've ever had, even my parents, right? Like it's just been like a heteronormative society, right? Like female teachers can talk about their pregnancy. Everybody knows how babies get there, but that's not seen as inappropriate. Women can talk about their engagements. Men can talk about how many children they have, all this stuff. But if someone like me wants to hang up a rainbow flag or I'm a safe space or, talk about my husband or, if they're a lesbian couple, my wife or, whatever it is, it's seen as inappropriate, right? We're seeing it manifest in certain states where they're banning books because a boy penguin, another boy penguin adopted an egg. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like sometimes it's just about like, it's based in fear and ignorance. And sometimes like literally sometimes it's just about exposing yourself to people that are different than you and being like, oh, like Bill and Ted are just like us.
Mhm.
Like, you know what I'm saying? I know it sounds so ridiculous, but it really is, right? Like the more that you expose yourself to people that are different than you, the
Mhm.
more likely you are to eliminate or at least minimize some of those biases.
Yeah.
So that's it.
We have been trying really hard to use person-centric language when we describe somebody who's living with a mental illness. So we are trying to avoid saying he's schizophrenic or she's bipolar, but instead saying he is living with schizophrenia, she is living with bipolar disorder. And I think that's a really important one because it really points out the difference that this is an individual who has a mental health issue. This person is not their disease. They are a lot of other things. This is one aspect of who they are. And the other one that I think matters is trying to avoid saying committed suicide.
Mhm.
Instead saying someone took their life or died by suicide, because the word commit connotes what? A crime or a sin. And so I think if we step away from that, it puts it in a little bit of a different light. There are some other language things that I think we don't have to worry about quite as much, because certainly language is important, but we can get caught up in some of that. I mean, there are people who will be angry with me for this, but I have no objection to using the word crazy as long as it's not describing a person.
Mhm.
I would not describe a person as crazy, but a crazy day or something like that, I have no issue. We've got bigger problems than to worry about that. But some of the other language I do think is important.
Yeah, I'll definitely second the person first language is something that we really try to strive for. It's a person who uses a wheelchair versus a wheel. Oh yeah, they need a wheelchair. What is it? They're confined to a wheelchair. There's this kind of stuff that always puts the disability first. At the same time, it tends to be, we recommend it as default. Try to use that first person first language always, except when people don't want that. Because in the disability community, sometimes, people go, no, this disability is part of my life and it touches every part of it. This is especially prevalent with people with autism, the autistic community. Most people with autism that I've encountered and just from polls I've seen prefer saying, I am an autistic person. I am autistic. At the same time, someone with muscular dystrophy might not say I'm a muscular dystrophy person. They might say I'm a person that happens to have that. So we always just say use whatever the individual prefers, but default to person first because it tends to be safer and more respectful in many cases. So, but that's kind of a universal. Just do what makes the individual most comfortable.
Yeah.
In terms of trauma informed and changing language, it's kind of out there. This is something that's helped me. There's this kind of theory that was put a while back. They called it E prime or English prime, where it was English, but they removed all instances of the to be or is, was, and all those definitive things. So it forces people to talk in context. So if I say, if we have someone who is disabled, um, a person with a disability, see, that person first language is so hard to go by. People always mess up. It's the effort. And they're having they're overwhelmed. They might seem frantic or this or that. You don't, it's so easy to say, yeah, they really can't make that choice, right? They can't make that choice. They're overwhelmed. But to say, John seems overwhelmed at the moment.
Mhm.
Not what they are. They're not overwhelmed. And that's period. That's definitive. That's defines who they are. At this moment, they seem to be overwhelmed. That still gives them a broader aspect to life. All right, if they calm down, if they're in a better setting, if they have people they're comfortable with, maybe they will be able to make this choice. Maybe they, instead of just assuming, especially in a situation where they're uncomfortable or something is happening, that
Mhm.
they can't do something. It's a very definitive statement. They can't. They are. This is the way it is. But well, today Here,
Mhm.
they aren't able, you know? So it's one of those things where context matters so deeply in these things, where unfortunately, disability, sometimes we only see those people in the worst cases when they are having a panic. They're very, very overwhelmed. You know, that's when we tend to see people, and people make kind of a big deal out of it. But you know, they aren't their worst symptoms. They're just a part of them, and the context matters. So I think that's very important to kind of remember the context of an individual, where they are, and you know, that doesn't always show their full competence or ability.
Well, it also like allows that space for people to be dynamic people, right? We're not static people that will never change and never grow, right? It's giving everyone that choice, that opportunity, that potential to, have a better day, to, whatever the case is. Like I saw a quote once that was like, if you have one bad thing happen and you let it affect the rest of your day, it's like having one flat tire and then slashing the other four, and you just, kind of keep going. But we're giving people that space to kind of decide how they want to live, how they want to be identified, how they want to, yeah, etc. Another thing that comes up specifically with language with us, with survivors, is, the topic of really our title, right? Where when we talk about domestic and intimate partner abuse, generally the nationwide um, language that is used is domestic violence and intimate partner violence, DV, IPV. But we're really specific as an agency to make sure to use domestic and intimate partner abuse, because we want to highlight the fact that, abuse isn't always violent. Abuse isn't always physical abuse. It isn't always sexual abuse, right? There are other levels of financial abuse, of emotional, verbal, psychological abuse that occur, of stalking, of digital abuse, where, again, where choice is taken away, where your identity is kind of removed, where you're isolated. And also giving people the choice of how they want to be identified as. For us, we'll use the term survivor, but sometimes people do prefer the term victim. And that's okay. Like that is ultimately their choice. It is their story. It's not my story. It's not your story. It's their story to decide how to proceed. So, being respectful of that as well. There are a couple of comments in the chat I just wanted to highlight. So we said the real link in mental health as you navigate acknowledging a change in your identity, whether that is being a member of the LGBTQ plus community, acquiring a disability, and even diagnosis of a mental disorder. Maybe I read that wrong, but that was one comment. Another comment said, I use person first when I talk about something in particular. I am part of the disability community and I am a person with cerebral palsy. I'm very big on using person first language. Yeah, thank you guys for commenting on that. As a parent with a child who has an IEP, I feel this greatly, teaching him and empowering self-awareness and ability advocacy. Thank you. And then kudos, because we are always our best advocates. It is not easy either. I think self-advocacy is one of those skills that like really is that. It's a skill that needs to be defined and decided on. So I guess my next question, as we're sort of kind of wrapping these things up, but what are some of the ways that we can, we've talked a little bit about misrepresentation. We've talked about kind of supporting and providing that safe space. But what are some ways that we can support survivors in accessing resources and, sharing that conversation? Again, kind of tying into that self-advocacy. How can we support survivors or, those who are going through different things in accessing and advocating for themselves to get the support that they need?
I'm going to take this from the LGBTQ plus lens, the queer community lens. So I think there's a lot of like individual things that folks can do. Like just the fact that you are attending these kinds of conversations is a really, really great step. Like people are always talking about like educate yourself, do your own research, that kind of stuff. Well, like this counts, right? The more language you are exposed to, the more people you are exposed to, the more affirming you can be, right? Like hearing people's stories makes you at least more aware that, oh, wow, like that never happened to me, but it can happen to somebody else. That's crazy. I hate that. You know what I mean? Like why is that allowed? Right. So in terms of like queer people, right? Like we just being aware that like just because there are homeless shelters, community centers, doctors, nurses, whatever, right? Like there has historically been bias towards queer people, right? Not a lot of people like to talk about this because it comes off as like anti-establishment, anti-cop, whatever. But a big part of our history as queer people is that we have been brutalized by police. We have been neglected by the medical community. We've been neglected by laws, discriminated against, right? So we can sit here and talk about like, oh, things need to be accessible, things need to be equitable, and that's true. But until we acknowledge that like those systems are controlled by people who have bias,
Mhm.
it's just going to be another cycle of like abuse. And, you know, when we're talking about domestic partner violence, right? Like a lot of people that are queer tend to have the same kind of community circle. I have this written down in my notes, so I'm going to talk about it really quick. You know, if two men are in a relationship, right, and they're not recognized as a relationship, right? Like gay marriage is a very like standard topic people talk about, but like gay divorce is another thing, right? The individualization of assets. If one is abusive and the other one isn't, right? That stigma that like men don't get abused, like that's, you know what I mean? Just beat them up, like who cares, right? Like that kind of language incorporates itself into the queer community. Um, you know, if a woman's center, right? It's a women's center. If they are trans exclusive or like not trans inclusive, right? You're eliminating that, like that language automatically eliminates access to, you know, whatever that trans woman may need, right? If she's a domestic, if she's suffered domestic violence, right? She won't be seen as a woman because of her, you know, whether she has operations or not, right? Like she may not get that care, right? An interesting thing that I um looked up in, you know, my just for not for funsies, but just because it's the work that I do. Um, you know, there is in a lot of the Bible Belt area, right? It tends to be the highest rates of like trans misogyny, so violence towards trans women, right? So there are men who, you know, cis men who are having relationships with trans women, but there's so much shame attached to it, they ended up being violent,
Mhm.
right? And there's also a higher correlation in the Bible Belt of like pornographic videos being viewed that are related to just trans women, right? So in that same realm where there's a high risk of like trans women being brutalized, you know, attacked, you know, because of intimate partner violence, they're also engaging in it, right? So that stigma, that shame that like, oh, I don't want people to know about it, but I still enjoy it, right? That, you know, that's something to be concerned about.
Yeah.
You know, so and these are just things that people don't think about, right? And this is what I say too, like homophobia, transphobia hurts everybody, whether you have someone in your family or not, or maybe you are just a cisgender guy that is attracted to a trans woman. Like that doesn't make you homosexual. That doesn't make you queer. It just you're just in a queer relationship, but
Yeah.
like she's still a woman, you
Yeah.
know, and you don't have to be ashamed of that. That's allowed, right? So just, you know,
And it's hurting everyone else's mental health that's involved too, right? Where these stereotypes and biases are much more harmful to those who might really need that support or need those resources. And if, you know, I am part of, let's say, an LGBTQ community, or I have that identity, but maybe I haven't come out and I'm in a community that's not as supportive, and I might see that happening, you know, it's a lot harder then for me to feel like, well, if I do speak out and get this help I need for crisis, for a mental health diagnosis, for, you know, my relationship, it makes it that much harder to feel like, oh, I actually will be supported. So
and
again, you're right that, you know, just because something doesn't happen to you, or just because you might not have that identity, doesn't make it any less valid or any less in need of support, for sure.
And back to that identity portion too, right? Like if some kind of violent crime happens to, I don't know, I'm going to focus mainly on trans people in this case, right? Like if you are a police officer or you are a police unit that doesn't believe that transness is a thing, right? You may just say like, oh, this man was killed and he was just wearing a dress, right? Like that skews information, that skews data, which then contributes to the language that we use that is anti-trans or homophobic or whatever, right? Like it just becomes this like cyclical, like violent, ignorant language that just contributes more to the manifestation of laws that are biased, hiring people that are ignorant. You know, it is cyclical, and how that manifests has some very serious repercussions for society in general.
Any other thoughts as far as accessing resources or how to help support that?
I'll say on two levels. One, kind of the interpersonal. I've definitely seen it as a trend more and more in the younger generations. But something that I think is overall that is a good thing is being more open and honest about the help and resources you're receiving. You know, I know more and more I hear people and my peers talking openly about, oh yeah, I was in therapy yesterday, or oh, I had to go to this place or the doctors and do this. And, you know, normalizing getting help for the things you need help with in everyday language makes it a lot more accessible. You know, you're not the only one thinking, oh, you know, all my friends, I'm the only person I know going to therapy. You know, that's scary. I'm an outsider. I'm this, but you know, hearing, oh, it's normal to do that. And then even then, hey, where do you go? Do you recommend anyone? You know, this or that. The same goes for workplace accommodations. You know, that is something that, you know, is with the ADA, you know, these are things that are required. If you have something, you can ask for them. But if you think, you know, let's say you work in a business with 50 people in it, if you think you're the only one there going to get accommodations and you go, you know, oh, you know, you're made to feel like, well, everyone else does it. You know, I struggle with this, but you know, I don't want to be the one asking to come in late, or you know, I don't want to be singled out. So just being open and honest about having accommodations if you do have them, or if you don't, just talking about it, and you know, just that these are normal things that you are allowed to ask for and deserve. The second is just, you know, it's a broad thing, but try to be involved in local politics. I'm not saying you have to run for office. Be aware who is running. Go to meetings. You know, I think this past week was the 34th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which, you know, awesome. It's wonderful, but people forget that's the foundation. That's not a solving everything. That is the bare minimum of what we have for disabilities. You know, we need to build the rest of the house now. So it's an ongoing thing, and you know, with politics everywhere, people focus on the really, really big ones, but you know, sometimes you can do a lot more and have impact on your local community and building up from there versus waiting for, you know, ADA number 2. You know, just the ADA was built on the small things that built up to it. So we need to keep doing that together at that local area and work our way. So, you know, those are my 2 things.
And I would just piggyback on that and say, make an appointment with your legislators. You know, the state and federal ones who serve wherever you live, because especially you don't have to go to Harrisburg, and it doesn't have to be a big hill day with a lot of people. Those are great, but an individual can be really effective just sitting down and talking to a legislator, telling them their own story and telling them what would make life better.
Absolutely. It looks like I don't have any new questions or anything that came in. If there are any questions, please feel free to drop them. We only have a couple minutes. I do want to quickly share my screen just because I think it'll kind of summarize some of the resources that are available. So hopefully you all can see that I kind of threw on all of the organizations that are with us today. And if they have any, you know, helplines or related helplines that you can reach out to. But I guess while we're wrapping up, if you guys want to just give a quick brief, you know, either piece of advice or, key takeaway that you might want people to leave, knowing a little bit more about what you do.
I would just say that we have, again, support groups, both for individuals and for family members. Those meet weekly. We have education courses that apologize for the sirens, education courses that take place once a week over the course of 8 weeks. And, the being not alone is really important. That's one of the most helpful things that people can understand, is they're not the only one going through this. And, there are other people and they can share experiences and support one another.
I'll say for LVCIL, they have a license for independent living. We are nonprofit, so nothing we do asks for payment. You don't need to pay for the services we have. We have our core services, our advocacy, independent living skills, our trying to remember them all on the fly, housing independent living skills, peer-to-peer support. The other things we do are we have housing, we have education and employment services. We have their peer support groups, sign language interpretation, waivers. We have a lot of things we do. You do not need, again, there's no wealth limit. You don't have to be lower. Anyone can come. You don't need an official diagnosis in anything to come and talk to us. We can help you with just advising and getting you to the right place if we're not. So just if you have any questions or anything related to disability of any kind, contact us, see what we can do to help you out.
We have a slew of different programs. We have a trans masculine group, a trans feminine group. We have a BIPOC group. BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. Our group, I believe it's called Shades. We have a bunch of other resources. We have a care cupboard. It's all free. Really, the only things that people really would pay for is if you wanted training from me for your organizations. And it's very comprehensive. I take it very seriously, but I also would like to promote it as this is where you make mistakes. Ask those uncomfortable questions. I am very comfortable with it. Remember, I taught middle school for many years. So I got a lot of, let's say, challenging questions as a teacher. So yeah, my big takeaway too is sometimes the queer stuff gets very confusing. People tend to be very aggressively anti-queer in general. But if you ever are struggling just in day-to-day banter, right? Just remember you are a brain before you are anything else, right? Your brain develops before anything else. Before you have genitals, before you have body hair, before you have hormones, right? Your brain is first. And as long as you hold on to that, right, you can acknowledge that people are just different, and that's okay. So that's it.
Yeah. And you have a brain, and that's why we're here to make sure that your brain is healthy and taken care of. And, all of our organizations are here to help support you in whatever you need. Please feel free to reach out at any point. And I just want to say thank you so much. I think this is a super important conversation. I'm so glad that you were able to join us. Sorry, we went a minute over, but I hope you have a wonderful day. Everyone stay safe. And if you have any questions, again, feel free to reach out to any of our agencies. So I hope you all have a great day. Thank you again, and stay safe. See ya. Thanks.